Chapter 4. The Journey Home. Dawn peered into Myra's chamber, illuminating the swirling particles of dust that danced in the air. Myra laid in her cot, the wool coverlets itching her bare arms. She groaned and rolled over, trying to fall back to sleep. She was so very tired. Her mother would have scolded her for staying up so late last night. "This is what happens to you when you don't let your body rest," Myra could hear her say in that matter-of-fact voice her mother used sometimes. "Just 5 more minutes, Mama," Myra mumbled, "please." There was a knock at the door and Myra groaned and cracked open her eyes. "It isn't locked," she called in a tired voice. An Arthurian girl dressed in a long white hooded robe opened the door and stepped inside. She bowed her head and told her that breakfast would be served in a few minutes. "Would you care to eat here or in the Great Hall?" she asked. Myra sat up and rubbed the sleep from her eyes. She looked at the Arthurian girl and said, "I'll have it in the hall." "As you wish, milady," the girl replied. "What time is it?" Myra asked. 6:45 in the morning, the girl replied, "on March the 31st if you want to know." 6:45, cried Myra. "Is something wrong with that hour?" asked the girl. No, nothing is wrong with it," replied Myra as she brushed her long red hair back with her hand. "It's just that I didn't get to sleep until around 1 o'clock in the morning." "I did not sleep at all last night if that makes you feel any better," the girl said with a shrug. "That just makes me feel guilty for getting some sleep," said Myra as she looked up at her and saw the dark circles under her eyes. "Do not trouble yourself over me, milady," the girl said. "This is not the first night where I have gone without sleep." "Why didn't you?" asked Myra. "I was helping Tiller tend to the boys," she replied. "We had our hands full but we managed to bandage up all their wounds." "Why didn't the boys just get up after the fighting was over?" asked Myra. "Why did they just lay where they fell?" "They were following the rules," she replied. "When the fur are fighting each other they have to follow a strict set of guidelines. When one of them is killed, he has to stay where he fell until the battle is over or until he is tended to by one of my fellow healers. The battle had been over for hours when I healed my last wound," said Myra. "They couldn't have all been waiting to be healed, could they?" "Normally they wouldn't have," the girl replied, "but I think they were observing the rules to the letter so they wouldn't be in as much trouble as they would have been otherwise." "How much trouble are they in?" Myra asked. "Enough," the girl replied. "All of the fighters of Algar's old fur will be forever remembered as oathbreakers for defying the Homegang. Crest's fighters will be in trouble for not standing down when Chieftain Kala and Emmett commanded him to." "What will happen to them?" asked Myra. "I don't know," the girl replied. "Nothing like this has ever happened before. But this matter is not for us to worry about. It's men's business, not women's work to figure out such things." "If you say so," said Myra. "I'll tell your friends you'll be down shortly," the girl said. "Thank you," said Myra as she pulled back her blankets and swung her legs out over the edge of her straw mattress. She still felt very tired and again rubbed the sleep from her eyes. 6:45 in the morning. She moaned, "No decent person should be up so early." "What do you consider a decent hour, milady?" asked the Arthurian girl. Myra looked up at her. "Never mind," she replied, "I'll be down in a sec." "Very good, milady," the girl said. She bowed her head and backed out of the room, closing the door behind her. Myra stood up. She stretched, yawned, and stretched again. She turned to put on her dress when she saw the curtains that partly covered the window were badly ripped. Myra wondered how that might have happened and then suddenly remembered that she had torn them. She had ripped them when she had seen the man who had been sneaking up on her the night before. Myra rushed to the window and looked out. The grassy fields were bathed in a warm glow as the sun dawned. There was no sign of him. Did I really just dream it after all? Myra thought as she turned away. Breakfast was not as lively as the feast from the night before. The boys sat slumped at their long tables and quietly ate their rations. All of them had dark circles under their tired eyes. More than a few of them were dreadfully hungover and winced and cringed at even the slightest noise, complaining of headaches. Several of the boys appeared to have fallen back to sleep, their soft snores giving the hall a subdued feeling. Daniel, Eric and Alfgeir sat together at the head table. Crest was nowhere to be seen. "Are you sure he hasn't been seen since last night?" asked Daniel, his voice thick with weariness. "Yes, I am," Eric grumbled. "No one's seen him." "I told you he went outside to help Tiller and the other girls with the wounded," said Alfgeir. "I said so last night." "That was last night though," replied Eric. "Where is he now?" "No idea," said Daniel, his eyes growing heavy. Who cares? Grumbled Alfgeir. Who cares about what? Asked Asa as he stepped up to them. He appeared bright and eager in comparison to them. We don't know where Crest got off to, Eric said with a yawn. Maybe he hasn't gotten up yet, offered Asa. His bed wasn't slept in, counted Eric. Besides, I already told you he went outside last night, added Alfgeir. Why would anyone sleep outside when they have a nice soft bed inside? Asked Daniel, ridiculous. That's Crest in a nutshell, mumbled Alfgeir. You take that back, growled Eric. Take what back? Yawned Daniel. I will not, said Alfgeir, I mean it. Take it back, ordered Eric. I didn't say anything, said Daniel. I'm not talking to you, said Eric, I'm talking to him, he added, pointing at Alfgeir. I will not take it back, said Alfgeir, your fur leader has got to be one of the most ridiculous people I've ever met, and that's saying something because I knew Algar. Eric nearly burst out laughing when he heard this but managed to smother the cackle in time. I won't argue with you there, he snickered, Algar really is a character, isn't he? You can say that again, agreed Alfgeir. Say what again? Asked Daniel, his head drooping heavily. Asa sat down next to Daniel and shook him. Wake up, Daniel, he said, it's time to rise and shine. Daniel growled and tried to push Asa away but missed. He flopped off the bench and found himself staring up at the wooden ceiling beams and thatched roofing. My poor head, he moaned as he held it. Both Asa and Eric got up and pulled Daniel to his feet. Too much mead, huh? Asked Eric. Daniel looked at Eric squinting with tired eyes and then he growled. I thought so, said Eric as he helped Daniel back to his seat. I told you, you shouldn't have drunk that stuff. The boys looked up to see Myra walking into the hall. Several of the youths at the other tables rose to their feet when she entered and bowed their heads. Daniel groaned when he looked up and saw her. Don't start with the, I told you so stuff, please, he moaned. Myra looked down at him and shook her head, her eyes rolling. Bea and Jason are going to kill you, she said. My head is already killing me. Daniel griped. I know one way for your head to stop pounding, offered Eric. Give it to me, yelped Daniel. Are you sure? Asked Eric. Of course I'm sure, growled Daniel, I don't care what it is, just make my head stop hurting. Please. Eric looked up to another boy and nodded. The boy left the hall but returned a short time later carrying a bucket. The youth stood behind Daniel and looked to Eric, who nodded his approval. The boy looked down at Daniel and upended the bucket, pouring the icy cold water all over his head. Daniel let out a squeal of shock and surprise as the water hit. He jumped to his feet, spluttering at Eric. Then to Daniel's surprise, Eric slapped him hard across the face. Daniel flopped down on the wooden bench, too bewildered to reply. Feeling any better? Asked Eric. Daniel just sat there, rubbing his smarting cheek and staring up at him. You hit me, he managed to stammer. I didn't hit you, replied Eric, I merely smacked you. Besides, if I did hit you, I think I would be justified in doing so. At saying this last part, he motioned to his bruised ankle, an injury that Daniel had given to him a few minutes after first meeting him. Is your head feeling any better? Eric asked again. Not by much, said Daniel, but I'm wide awake now. And more than half bathed, added Alfgeir. Why did you think that would work, Eric? Asked Asa. My cousin, Snorri, said Eric, I remember seeing my father doing that stuff to him after one night of merrymaking. He sobered up after about the third dunk in the barrel, or was it the fifth? It was a long time ago. Third dunk, fifth dunk? Asked Daniel, looking suddenly concerned. Yep, which means you have either 2 or 4 more washes left to go, Eric said with a smirk. You know, suddenly remembered that I had meant to go find Crest outside, Daniel stammered as he stumbled to his feet and lurched towards the exit. See you all later, he cried as he crashed through the double doors with a bang and a clang. Steady on there, lad, cried Carla as Daniel barged past him. Where's the fire? Asked Emmett, who was close behind Carla. Daniel made no answer as he scrambled away. He moved as though his life depended on it. Both chieftains laughed as they watched him go. He's soaked to the skin, noted Carla. Look here, he's gotten the front of my tunic all wet. Don't worry about it, you little cub, chuckled Emmett, it will dry off long before we ever reach the dunes. Myra, Asa and the rest of the youths within the hall turned when they heard the word dunes. So we are leaving today? Asked Eric. Indeed, said Carla, today is the day we have longed for, nay 12,000 years. 12,000 years last Tuesday if I remember correctly, Emmett added. Bah, who cares what exact day it was? boomed Carla, all that matters is that we're going back to our rightful place in the world. I can't wait to show my little Bjornolf where I grew up. If it's still there, replied Emmett. Carla gave him a sour look and glared at him. What a bundle of optimism you are this morning, he said. Come on, lighten up. We're going home, Emmett, home. Home, sighed Emmett, it will be good to see it again. Home, Eric said as he looked around at the hall. He appeared suddenly anxious. Myra and Asa noticed that many of the Arthurian boys were indeed excited about going to their ancestral homeland, but several of them looked worried. What's wrong, boys? Carla said when he saw their apprehension. Nothing, Lord Carla, said Eric, it's just, he trailed off. It's just that you were born and raised here in exile and don't know any other world except the sanctuary, finished Emmett. Eric, Alfgeir and several other boys nodded in agreement. Don't worry about that, Carla cried. Why, when we reach the shores and set foot on that hallowed ground, you'll forget all about this place. The big Arthurian made a sweeping motion with his outstretched arms around the hall. He continued to speak, saying, I dare say that when you reach my age, you'll look back on the sanctuary and say, what a dreadfully boring place that was. I wish we could have gotten to Arthuria sooner than we did. A few of the boys mumbled at this but said nothing more. Well, before that can happen they will have to pack their things, said Emmett, stepping forwards. Are we leaving right now? Asked Asa. This very hour, answered Emmett. But I haven't had my breakfast yet, protested Myra. Well, that's easily fixed, laughed Carla. Just grab a bowl of porridge and get ready to go. But I hate porridge, Myra mumbled under her breath as the Arthurian boys dashed off to collect their things. Crest slowly woke up. He found himself outside on the grassy ground. He was wrapped up in a cloak that didn't belong to him. It was snow white and both soft and warm. He tried to sit up but felt a weight holding him down. When he looked down he saw Tilla, fast asleep, her head resting on his chest. Crest froze, not daring to move, fearing that he would wake her. It took him a moment to remember how he came to be there. I was helping her last night, he thought. She was healing the boys and I was helping her. He remembered how both he and Tilla had been joined by other healers, mostly girls from the tribe of doves. When they had arrived, Crest recalled how he had managed to convince Tilla to put aside her bandages and herbs. You can let the others take up the slack, he had said to her, let them look after them. Take some rest now, we must have fallen asleep then, he thought as he looked at her. A cool breeze blew softly and gently rustling Tilla's long hair. She stirred slightly, sighed, and then slowly opened her eyes. Crest had always noted how bright and keen they were, but he had never been this close to her before. He noticed they were silvery grey-blue with flecks of hazel. Good morning, he said. Tilla looked up at him as she rubbed the sleep from her eyes. Morning, she replied as she lifted herself up. As she rose she wrapped the white cloak around herself and shivered slightly. The sun was still rising and the chilly night air had yet to be fully banished. Crest stood up and stretched, cracking his knuckles as he did so. Did you sleep well? He asked her. I did, thank you, she replied. I'm glad you did, chuckled Crest. You were using me as a pillow after all. And you were a very nice pillow, she smiled. I didn't know that you were full of goose feathers. Crest opened his mouth to protest being called a goose but decided against it. It wasn't worth an argument, but he had a cheeky idea. Well, at least I don't honk like a goose, he said, rubbing his ears. Your snoring could wake the dead. How dare you? I never snore, cried Tilla. You sure? Asked Crest. How can you be sure if you're not awake to hear yourself? I never snore, you liar, scoffed Tilla. You on the other hand. Oh, I fully admit that I snore, laughed Crest. The only difference between us is that I own up to it. You're not a very good fibber, Crest, yawned Tilla. She was absolutely right, of course. She knew that she never snored and she saw that he was only having some harmless fun at her expense. Let him play his joke, she thought as she looked at him. Perhaps I'll play a joke on him in return. Crest shook his head and turned away, looking towards the fort. It's hard to believe that it's really mine now, he said. I remember when it was nothing but a cluster of tents. Algar was a master builder, said Tilla. You'll have to thank him the next time you see him. I doubt it will be any time soon, said Crest. He'll be bedridden for weeks with the thrashing Daniel gave him. And Arngir making him ride will not help him heal any faster, said Tilla, cringing as she thought of how painful the bumpy ride would have been. Arngir's an old bully, spat Crest. He insulted you and he hit Daniel. I could have killed him for that. But he did pay the Werigid, said Tilla. Yes, he did at that, said Crest as he touched the money pouch that hung from his belt. It hadn't felt so heavy in years. Crest turned to see Tilla looking back towards Stagens Festning. He followed her gaze and saw that his red banners were being lowered. Hey, he cried, I didn't give any orders to do that. Aren't you forgetting that we're leaving the sanctuary today? Asked Tilla, you can't bring your banners and the fort with you. Crest opened his mouth to say something but couldn't think of anything. He turned around and shrugged at Tilla. You have a point there, he admitted. It's almost sad when you think about it, she said suddenly. You and Algar have fought over each other's land and forts for centuries, and now that you've finally won them all, you have to go and leave them behind. Crest's face turned slightly pale at hearing this. He hadn't given the matter much thought since he had beaten Algar. With his newly gained territories and wealth, his fur would have been second to none among the others. But now the Arthurians were about to leave the sanctuary forever. We were fighting in vain all this time. Crest thought as he looked at her and cursed her logic. Yeah, it is kind of sad when you think about it, he said, and he tried to keep his face from showing the emotions he was feeling. Well, look on the bright side, said Tilla. Bright side? Asked Crest, turning to face her. When we finally get home there will be so much more room for you too, she chuckled. You can claim all the free lands that you want. Crest considered this for a moment. The sanctuary was large, but if the stories concerning his ancestral homeland were only half true, then it was tiny by comparison. Do you think it will be like the stories? He asked her. I hope so, said Tilla. I hope it's the way I dreamed it to be. I wish my parents were still here to see this, said Crest, his face falling slightly as he recalled their abductions by the 3 dragon witches. I wish my mother could have seen this, said Tilla, recalling the terrible day when she was carried away in the claws of a basilisk. They were silent for a moment, mourning their lost loved ones. The breeze blew gently and rustled the grass at their feet and Tilla's long hair. They looked at each other after their reflections. Well, either way, today is here at last, said Crest. The day of all days, said Tilla. We better get our things together, said Crest. If you forget anything you'll never see it again. They turned towards Stagens Festning and walked together, wading through the knee-high grass. There was much to do before everyone was ready to leave the fort. Every donkey, mule, ox and horse that had been stabled within its walls was laden with increasingly heavy burdens. Stores of food, water skins, extra bundles of clothing, chests of medicine and large bags filled with gold and silver coins. Algar's treasure hoard had been truly as great as he had boasted. In the fields outside the Mott and Bailey fort, the vast fields of wheat, rye and barley were being harvested. Every last scrap of food was to be taken with the Arthurians on their march north. Everyone was working as busily as bees in a kicked hive. Even Myra and Asa found themselves conscripted into helping the Arthurians pack. Currently they were using their magic to levitate large iron-bound chests and wooden barrels onto carts. Even with their powers it was hard work, and soon they were both sweating and panting. I haven't touched a thing and my arms still feel like they're going to fall off, grunted Asa as he and Myra floated the last barrel onto the wagon. The wain creaked as it took the cask's weight. Just think of it as extra practice, said Myra as she wiped the sweat from her brow. Or exercise, said Daniel as he heaved a wooden box onto another cart. You look like you need it, he said as he turned to Asa. What's that supposed to mean? Asked Asa as he turned to face him. Oh, nothing, said Daniel, you're just tiny is all. Tiny? Chuckled Asa. All skin and bones, said Daniel. Myra looked at them. Even though the boys were roughly the same height, she noted that Daniel was slightly bigger than Asa, whose pale face and thin frame made him stand out among the Arthurian boys who were in prime shape. Daniel, when I lived in Empire City all I had to eat was leftover garbage and live rats, said Asa. Daniel cringed at hearing this. Yeah, I saw how hungry you all were, he said as he unhooked his canteen off his belt. He offered some to Asa, who took a long drink from it and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. You have no idea, he said as he handed the bottle back to him. Well, now you are here with us, said Eric as he walked over to them. You'll be just like the rest of us within weeks, he added. I wouldn't mind being as strong as you, said Asa, but I don't think I could pull off wearing all that stuff you've got on. He motioned to Eric's hauberk and other gear. It takes some getting used to, Eric admitted, but eventually you do. From what I hear you'll both be finding out for yourselves soon enough. What do you mean? Asked Myra. There's a rumor saying that Her Highness is having hauberks, helmets, shields and swords especially made for you two, Eric explained. Apparently the smiths started to work on him the moment you arrived here. Myra and Asa looked at each other. So they would be finished by now? Asked Daniel. Eric turned to him and said, I don't know. As I said, it's only a rumor. What would I do with a sword and shield? Asked Asa. I've never held a sword in my life. Well, that's easily fixed, said Eric as he pulled out his wooden one and offered it to him. Asa took the sword and turned it over in his hands. The blunted blade was worn and notched at several points along the length. It felt heavy. Asa could see that it was an old piece, but it was still rigid and strong. Age had yet to gnaw away at it. Then Asa felt a slight tingle in his fingertips. He knew at once what that meant. There was magic in the wood. Asa wasn't sure what type of spell it was. Perhaps one to keep termites away from it, or maybe the magic kept it from breaking while it was bashed about. Maybe it was both of these. Asa looked at the sword again before handing it back to Eric. Very interesting, he said as Eric sheathed it. What will you name your sword if you're getting one? Asked Eric. Name? Said Asa, puzzled. You must always name your sword, said Eric. It's a part of you, an extension of your arm. To do otherwise is considered to be unlucky. I don't even have the sword yet, said Asa. We don't even know if we're getting swords or not, said Myra, stepping closer. You did say it was only a rumor, Eric, said Daniel. I did say that, Eric admitted, but sometimes rumors come true. A horn was blown and the boys stopped their packing. They looked up at the sentry who stood atop the watchtower. The boy pointed out beyond the walls and called down to them. The host of the seers are marching this way. He said, the banner of the all-seeing eye is carried before them. I can see Lord Strath and his sister riding at the head. The whole tribe of seers is on the move. The air was then filled with the steadily growing sound of marching feet, neighing horses, horns blasts and trumpet calls. The boys who were part of the tribe of seers rushed to the gates and flung them ajar. Through the opening Myra could see the cloud of dust approaching the fort. Soon her elven eyes could make out the Arthurians as they advanced. There were mail-clad men on horses, armed with shields and long spears. There were other warriors who marched on foot alongside their mounted comrades. Along with the weaponed men marched their women and children. There were countless heavily laden wagons drawn by beasts of burden along with herds of cattle and horses, flocks of sheep and goats and gaggles of flightless geese. The cries of the animals filled the air with a chaotic cacophony. Banners of many colors were flapping in the wind, leading the host. In the center of each flag was set a large round eye. Myra caught her breath. There were so many of them. And this was just the vanguard of one tribe. Then she saw Strath sitting astride his grey horse, his cloak wrapped around his shoulders and his white quarterstaff nestled in the crook of his arm. His colorless unseeing eyes peered straight ahead and Myra shuddered when she saw them. She had the sense that even though the Arthurian was blind he could still see her somehow. As Strath drew closer he seemed to grow suddenly tense. He reined in his horse and stopped. The rest of his tribe marched past him, eager to get to the marshalling grounds to begin the homeward journey. The host continued on its way, tramping past the fort. Strath and another rider turned their horses and approached Stangen's Festning. As they drew closer Myra saw that the other rider was a woman. She was clad in mail and had a sword sheathed at her side like the other warriors. Her long blonde hair was tied in a single braid that was draped over her left shoulder. Her eyes were fierce and had pink irises, giving her an exotic look. Her face was veiled with a silken cloth. She was Tyeri, Strath's twin sister, shield maiden of the tribe of seers. Myra and Asa had only seen Tyeri once before, but that first impression had been enough. There was a hardness in her eyes and a coldness in her gaze that made the two youngsters feel slightly uneasy. Myra and Asa had both been told the tragic story of Strath and Tyeri. When the two Arthurians had been young they had been tricked into going out onto the dunes where they were captured and tortured by Pharodenic slavers. The men had blinded Strath and scarred his face with the markings of their desert faith while they had cut out Tyeri's tongue. The two Arthurian siblings had only survived because of the sacrifice of their late father, Zarnia, the only Arthurian chieftain to die in exile. Strath was the youngest of all the tribal chiefs and Tyeri was his bodyguard. As Strath drew closer he slowed his horse and stood up in his stirrups. He leaned his head back and sniffed the air like a bloodhound on a scent. When he lowered his gaze Myra saw the sudden look of worry on his scared face. He turned to Tyeri. Here as well, he said to her. His sister nodded curtly and both she and Strath dismounted their steeds. Once on foot, Thierry walked over to her brother and gently directed him towards the fort. "Greetings, Myra, Asa," he said as he drew closer. After taking a few more guided steps, Thierry let go of him and he continued on alone. He stopped and stood on a grassy spot a few dozen yards from the wooden walls. He held his quarterstaff in his right hand and held out his left with the fingers splayed wide open. He stooped low to the ground and began passing his staff over the soil back and forth, back and forth. He moved slowly and deliberately like he was feeling for something. "What are you doing?" asked Asa. "Never mind what I'm doing," replied Strath in a somewhat distracted voice, "just keep packing your things. You all have a long journey ahead." Several of the boys had stopped their packing to watch the seer at his strange work. A few of the more magically inclined youths realized what he was doing and resumed their labor. Many of the other boys, however, continued to stare at the gray-haired, scarred-faced Arthurian. They probably would have stayed like that until Strath found whatever it was he was looking for had it not been for Thierry. The shield maiden stood in between her brother and the curious youths. She glared harshly at them and tapped the hilt of her sword with impatient annoyance. The boys quickly turned around and resumed their packing. They knew better than to incur the wrath of one that their parents called Virvelwind av Sin, the whirlwind of anger. Myra and Asa knew nothing of Thierry's reputation and kept watching Strath as he continued his strange display. The blind Arthurian had straightened up and was now tapping the ground ahead of him with his staff. The white wooden stave glowed slightly at the end whenever he tapped it at a certain place. This appeared to both please and alarm him. Most curious, Strath said absent-mindedly. "What are you doing?" Myra asked him. "Jeg letter etta spor etta magi," the Arthurian replied in his native language. "I don't understand that," Myra said as she watched him. "I don't think we're going to get anything out of him for the moment," said Asa. Myra peered over her shoulder at him and then turned back to Strath. It was clear to her that the Arthurian was too caught up in whatever it was that he was doing to notice them. He was once again crouching low to the ground, passing his staff from side to side and muttering to himself. "You're right," said Myra, turning to face Asa. "Is there anything else for us to pack?" "Well, I thought we were done loading the last wagon," said Asa, "but now I suspect that the others will find some more work for us to do." "It's not work," said Myra, "it's practice." "I don't need the practice, Myra, you do," Asa replied. "We both need practice," said Myra as she turned towards the cluster of carts. An hour passed. Myra and Asa used their magic to load another 12 carts. During all that time the tribe of seers continued to march by and Strath continued his strange muttering and waving his staff in front of him. The sun was hot and bright overhead. Myra and Asa were sweating by the time they were finished. "My arms haven't been this sore since I helped my papa harvest Mr. Cornwall's field," panted Myra. "How long ago was that?" asked Asa. 2 years, Myra answered. "My arms have never been this sore before," said Asa as he rubbed his shoulder. "Have you never used your magic to lift things before?" asked Myra. "No, I haven't," replied Asa, "except when you made us stack stones into piles. I always used my magic to make my bombs more powerful and to hide better in the dark." "I think you'll both be using your magic in very different ways before this is over," said Eric as he walked towards them. "Oh, don't tell me we have to load another cart," groaned Asa, his arms hung heavily at his sides. "No, we're all done packing," answered Eric, his face beaming with excitement. "We're finally going home." The enthusiasm that the red-haired boy felt was shared by all of the other Arthurian youngsters. They seemed to be bursting with the nervous energy that all children shared when they're about to get their heart's greatest wish. The horses and ponies were also neighing and whinnying with eagerness. They champed at their bits and stamped their hooves and strained at their hitching posts. One little white pony proved too strong for its restraint and snapped the leather cord that tied it in place. Bayaz whinnied and trotted up to Myra, tossing her flowing white mane. "She seems ready to go," chuckled Eric as the pony nuzzled the she-elf. "Better hop on before she decides to leave without you. You wouldn't want to have to cross the desert on foot." "No, I wouldn't," shuddered Myra. She remembered when they had first arrived in the endless sands. Myra and the others had been lost for several hours among the dunes. She couldn't remember a time when her throat had felt so parched. "I could never cross the sands without Bayaz's help," she thought as she gently caressed the pony's neck. Bayaz was already saddled. Myra put her foot in the stirrup and swung her leg up. She could feel Bayaz's excitement as she sat astride her back. The other children were also mounting their steeds or climbing atop their heavily laden wagons. The very air seemed charged with anticipation for the homeward journey. Several of the youngsters refused to wait any longer. They spurred their horses and galloped away, laughing and hooting with glee. They fell in with the members of the tribe of seers and were soon lost amid the marching multitude. As the boys rode past the seers chieftain and his sister, he finally concluded his spell and stood up, leaning heavily upon his white staff. His scarred face was weary from the effort. He panted for several seconds, trying to catch his breath. Strath had never encountered such a strong spell before, nor had he ever seen such skill at concealing it. It had been by pure chance that he had sensed it at all. At first he had thought that the magic had belonged to Myra or Asa. But as he investigated, he realized that neither of them had any reason to try and hide their magics. The effort to peel back the layers of concealment had taken a toll on his stamina. He would need to rest, sooner rather than later, if it could be helped. He felt a hand on his shoulder. He knew it was Thierry. "I'm all right," he said reassuringly, touching her hand, just winded. Thierry nodded. Strath turned and walked towards Myra and the others, his staff tapping the ground in front of him as he went. "Myra, are you still there?" he called out. "I'm right here," she replied. "We both are," said Asa as he rode up beside Myra. He was now mounted on his own pony, a sleek black colt named Sia. "Good. I need to talk to you," said Strath. He stopped short and gazed at them with his white unseeing eyes. Myra knew that the Arthurian was blind, but she still felt as though he could see her by some other way. For some reason this thought disturbed her. "What were you doing back there?" asked Asa. "I already told you what I was doing," Strath replied, turning to face him. "But you said it in that strange language of yours," Asa countered. "I couldn't understand a word you said." "Ah yes, forgive me, I did," chuckled Strath with a shake of his head. "I was so caught up that I guess, well, never mind. That's not important right now. I was looking for traces of magic." "Magic?" asked Crest as he approached them. Tiller was close behind him. "Enough to fool a dragon, it would seem," replied Strath. Myra felt a chill crawl up her spine as she listened. "They tell me that the wall guards almost caught an intruder last night," said Strath, "an intruder trying to sneak out of the sanctuary." Both Crest and Tiller went pale at hearing this. "That's impossible," Crest cried. "No one can sneak over the mountains." "That may be true, Crest," said Strath, "but the fact of the matter is this. A very powerful sorcerer was sneaking around the sanctuary last night, and it appears he was here." At hearing this, Myra clenched her hand into a fist and punched Asa on the shoulder as hard as she could. "Ow!" he cried, giving her an incredulous look. "I told you he was real," she growled, her eyes flashing with annoyed anger. "You didn't believe me." "Neither did Amaron," Asa yelped in his defense. "That is both very interesting and very alarming at the same time," said Strath, scratching his chin. "Dragons are highly sensitive to magic. If Amaron couldn't sense him, then he must have been using a very powerful spell of concealment. Such a feat could only be done at the hands of a master." "We saw him too," cried Crest, gesturing to himself and Tiller as he spoke, "or at least I think we did." They quickly told the others about their encounter with the dark menace that had appeared out of the gloom and then quickly had disappeared before them. "I thought it was just a dark cloud covering the moon or a patch of dense fog," said Crest. "It loomed up in the darkness and then went away. And the moment it was gone, you started to come up with excuses for what it was and why we shouldn't be worried about it," said Tiller, glaring at Crest. "You and Amaron did the exact same thing," cried Myra as she scowled at Asa. "Don't be too harsh on him, my ladies," said Strath. "They were being affected by a perception hex, the most powerful one I have ever come across in my life." "What's a perception hex?" asked Crest. "It is an enchantment that causes people to overlook something," explained Strath. "The more powerful the spell is, the more you ignore whatever is hexed." "Then why did I see him if he had the spell on himself?" asked Myra. "Perhaps he hadn't activated the magic at that moment, which means he wanted you to see him," said Strath. "Why?" asked Myra, a cold feeling of dread building in the pit of her stomach. "I don't know," replied Strath. A heavy silence hung over them as the full weight of what had happened slowly dawned on the youngsters. "I saw him again after Amaron roared at him," Myra said slowly, recalling the memory as if it had been some half-forgotten dream. "He was standing outside my window," she continued. "What was he doing?" asked Strath. "Nothing," answered Myra. "He just stood there, looking up at me. Then he waved at me, he waved almost playfully. Then he put his finger to his lips, turned around and walked away." He dissolved in the moonlight as I watched. I told myself I was only dreaming, he hadn't really been there. But now you will be under guard until his purpose and identity are determined, interrupted Strath day and night. Myra looked up at Strath and silently nodded her head. She couldn't argue with his logic. As she watched Strath go, she felt a nagging question squirming in the back of her mind. If the man in black had meant to do her harm, why hadn't he attacked her last night? Myra couldn't think of an answer. The chieftain of the tribe of Seers turned about and whistled for his horse, a blind grey mare called Ghost. He mounted his steed and trotted to rejoin his people. His sister rode after him. You had better get moving, he called over his shoulder at the gathered youths. The marshalling has already started. Once we leave the sanctuary there will be no coming back. His words took immediate effect. The youngsters let out a cry of excitement. They spurred their horses and urged on their teams of oxen. Wagons lurched forward. Boys laughed while girls giggled gaily. The whole throng was now on the move and fell in with the tribe of Seers. The fort of Stagens Festning now stood empty and abandoned behind them. Its wooden walls were now void of defenders and sentries. Its watchtowers and gatehouses were bereft of flags and banners. It stood alone, surrounded on all sides by empty fields whose crops had just been harvested. Its great hall, once the scene of many feasts, songs and fights, was now silent and dark. The fire in the central hearth had burned down to ashes and would never be relit. The benches and tables had been carried away, leaving the stone floor empty. The only stick of furniture that remained was a stool that had been forgotten and left behind. It had fallen on its side and one of its legs had broken off. A mouse crept out from its peephole in the wall and quietly scampered across the flagstones. It found a small chunk of stale bread crumbs and quickly began to eat. It was the only living thing left in the fort. Everyone else was gone now, the boys, the girls, the cats that had hunted it and the other mice as well. All gone. It would be many long years before Stagens Festning was ever host to another feast. Several of the youngsters looked back at the fort. They had spent hundreds of years fighting over it, spying on it and escaping from it. As the distance between them and their playground grew wider, they slowly turned their faces away. That chapter of their lives, though it had been wonderful and full of fun and excitement, was over now. Ahead of them lay the journey that they had been told about since they had been old enough to understand. They were leaving the only world that they had ever known and were returning to their true home. Far to the north, across the arid desert and the wide sea, it waited for them, Arthuria. The land of legend, the land of wonder and adventure, the land of giants and dragons, the land of forests and rivers and mountains and meadows. They had been told stories of the land for as far back as any of them could remember. At last they were going there. They were going home.